You're listening to the ProcureTech podcast, your weekly show for all that's cooking in the digital procurement space. Yes, we've got the hottest startups, thought leadership, and conversation from visionary industry experts, and definitely no stiff corporate content. I'm your host, James Meads, procurement pro, digital nomad, and ProcureTech fanboy. And now, here's this week's show. Yes, hello there. Very warm welcome to another episode of the ProcureTech podcast, where every week we bring you everything that is fun, exciting, and innovative in the digital procurement space. And this week we're taking another look at the contract management ecosystem and how this kind of pivots over a little bit into the legal tech space in one form or another. So in the past, we've talked about blockchain in contracts with Elena from InHubber, and then we were looking at how AI can be used and leveraged to help redline and autocorrect and do marked up changes in contracts with Dan from Black Boiler. Now, today we're going to be looking at some of the more contract process automation features that a digital procurement or legal technology platform can offer in this space to make buyers and lawyers' lives both easier. And as part of this conversation, we are going to have a look at why sometimes that relationship can be a little bit strained, and then dig into some of the solutions and some of the technology that can help alleviate that and make buyers and lawyers like each other again. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring in this week's guest, who is Giles Thompson of London-based legal tech startup Avvoka. Giles, welcome to the show.
Hi, James. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And actually, it's really interesting to hear the context of a lot of the people who've been on the show previously. You know, they're names that we know pretty well. And I guess we're just, filling in the puzzle a little bit more today.
Yeah, and that's, you raise a good point, because a lot of this tech is looking at it from a buyer's perspective, very, very complementary to each other, and kind of solves a different problem. If we look at blockchain or AI-driven redline especially, and then how your little piece comes in terms of process automation within contracts, I think each one of those is very, very complementary, and you could almost, especially in a big organization, argue the case for having all three of them within your ecosystem. So before we kick off, maybe just spend a little bit of time just sharing a bit about your background, because you're actually a lawyer by training, aren't you? And then how you became involved in Avvoka, and then we can dive into why do buyers and lawyers hate each other.
No, absolutely, yes. So, my background is I trained at Herbert Smith Freehills, a law firm in London, lots of people will be familiar with. Then I actually ended up being a patent litigator at Kirkland and Ellis. But actually, in the intervening period, I worked at Pax / Joule, the vaporizer company, which a lot of people will be familiar with, or one was spun out from the other, and also BP International, where I supported the international indirect procurement contracting process there. So have some experience, I guess, as a lawyer, but trying to be as commercial a lawyer as I possibly can in that context. And yeah, why do I do what I do? Well, I saw a huge opportunity when I was practicing. We were doing a lot of work for really big corporates, whether that was sort of litigation or more contracting. And the process for, taking a draft contract from a precedent and converting it into a live document with all of the relevant commercial details and the right content in it was cumbersome. And actually, when I was at BP International, advising procurement people, I was often repeating myself a lot, giving people the same advice, lifting and shifting the same paragraphs to go into the same different documents, when quite frankly, those people would have been better off clicking a couple of boxes instead of having to pick up the phone to me, and actually only picking up the phone to me where perhaps they needed a bit of lawyer clout on a call with them actually during a negotiation, as opposed to just basically having me green light a very basic amendment to a contract, which I needn't have green lit at all. And in terms of, I guess, what I do now, is it worth me covering that now, James?
Yeah, you can do briefly. Yeah, we'll jump into some of the solutions that Avvoka helps to solve or automate a little bit later. But yeah, maybe just give us the helicopter view, and then we can dig into the specifics a little bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, basically what I do now is I'm head of growth at Avvoka, and what Avvoka does is contract or document automation, collaboration, negotiation, and analytics. It's a platform for doing all of those things. So, I mean, essentially taking that first, draft of a contract or a document and making it a process of filling in an online form and then generating that contract or document, however complex, and then taking care of the rest of the sort of life cycle of that document.
And looking back to my time working in corporate procurement, I feel that would be an extremely valuable thing to have within my repertoire of tools, because if we go into now areas where procurement and legal can often get frustrated with each other, one of the things that I noticed, and I certainly think this is pretty endemic in most large corporates, is that if they have in-house legal teams, generally speaking, they are staffed to focus more on sales rather than purchase contracts. And the worm is changing a little bit now, especially with more focus on things like risk management and ESG and traceability of materials, that type of thing. The danger of scandals being out there and the brand damage that can do. But the biggest frustration, I think, was it just took legal too long to respond, and it wasn't because they didn't take what we were asking them to do seriously. They just didn't have the headcount to deal with a policy of everything should go to legal.
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with that. And actually the way that legal service teams within, I guess, corporates or even where they are actually an outsourced service provision, they're having to transform the ways that they do things hugely. And actually they're under huge pressure because they've got smaller teams themselves and they're servicing more and more people. So, I have to, give that qualifier because that is where I guess I came from. But actually on the other side, I'm now effectively a salesperson, and the job of that a salesperson is doing from a contractual process perspective is almost identical to someone who's in the procurement side. I think, at the very basic level, I don't think that the default should be actually speaking to a lawyer. I mean, if there's a problem, people always want a lawyer on the end of the phone. But actually, if you are, procurement person or a salesperson, and it's sort of 9 o'clock and you're just trying to get a contract out on the Friday just before you go and start your holiday, you don't want to have to set up a meeting the next week or, as soon as you're back with a lawyer, so that they can do that for you. And you don't want to necessarily fill out some overly prescriptive form so that they can then subsequently just send you back a document. What you really want is an online portal that you can go into, input certain data in, and then actually just download your document straight away. Either that or automatically have it routed through and sent through to your counterparty using that system. So it's actually kind of moving away from that model of actually having to ask for permission, because let's be honest, like the procurement staff and the sales staff, they're the rock stars in these organizations. I maybe it's a bit controversial to say with your listenership, arguably maybe more the salespeople, but if you get a great deal on procuring a major thing that the organization has to procure, I mean, you're still smashing the margin in a really appreciable way and improving profit. But yeah, actually it's moving to that focus where those people are getting what they want when they want it. And then in all that time that you're saving, where the legal person isn't having to sort of bespokely create that document, they can be tagged in relation to a particular agreement. So they can literally have their email address tagged in a comment, and they can come in and provide bespoke advice where truly bespoke advice is required. And actually one of the really cool things that I think, I think that sells this hugely to procurement and sales staff is if there is a trend in every negotiation, if you're having to ask for a particular stop clause or a particular amendment every single time, that shows that your, template contracts aren't fit for purpose. If you want to get more deals done, the business has got to make a commercial decision. Does it want to keep that annoying provision in there, or does it want to delete it? And actually by using a system where all of that negotiation is tracked, all the contents of those first drafts are tracked, it means that the commercial people can go in and look and see, look, we're getting this particular liability provision or whatever it is taken out every single time. So actually, let's just scrap it. And then we're going to be able to actually procure stuff a little bit more smoothly and a little bit, more sensibly. And actually that template that everybody's working with becomes more workable, more useful, and frankly, less of a headache for the people that are forced to use it. And, it's really easy to say to the legal team, look, your template is absolutely killing us. It's flogging us. Nobody ever agrees to provision. Why on earth do you insist on it? And then they, maybe they say, well, we got told to in law school. it means that those commercial people can actually say, look, the reality is this is absolutely killing us and you need to remove it. And here's the data that shows why. So there's lots of reasons why it can be really, really helpful.
Hey, so just a quick interlude to let you know about procurementsoftware.site. This is a new website that I recently launched to give you, the listener, a free-to-access, intuitive guide to digital procurement technology. You can filter on a multitude of different criteria and pick out a short list of procurement software solutions that are relevant to your business and your needs in less time than it takes to boil an egg. No corporate subscriptions, no complex jargon, and definitely no pay-to-play model. We are a completely transparent, open book, and we really want to get your feedback on what we can really do to make this user experience better and constantly improve so as we're providing value to you. Check out procurementsoftware.site, and now let's get right back to this week's podcast. That buyers often don't feel confident negotiating legal documents because of a lack of formal contract training. And, while a lot of new people coming into the profession will probably get that as part of their professional education, if they're doing something like a SIPS qualification, for example, a lot of established procurement pros may not have come across a lot of legal terminology in the past so much because it wasn't such a core sort of part of their role. And you hit on a really good point that often contracts are written in such a one-sided way. And you're right, it is kind of counterproductive if that means that every time a contract's negotiated, a lawyer has to get involved. But then if the procurement team is not empowered to be able to take that clause out or to replace it with a less strong but still acceptable wording, that's another way that we either often feel exposed because of our lack of knowledge, or we feel that our hands are tied because we've been given a tool that's not really fit for function. So yeah, every contract is different, right? But typically the types of clauses that come up as being the sticking points are going to be the same for most different categories and in most different organizations, I suspect.
Absolutely. And I think another point that's sort of related to this is the quality of advice you're going to get from a legal advisor. If let's say that we're talking about the liability provision, if you're asking, if there are 100 people asking 100 separate questions to, a team of 10 people, the average answer that, in their 10 answers that each member of the legal team is going to give, it's going to be quite scant, it's going to be quite brief, and it's going to be quite delayed. But actually, if you centralize a lot of this advice, and it's the same basic, let's assume it's the same basic question as everybody's asking, what you can do is you can do stuff like incorporating in the forms videos. So, using that time where there's 100 questions would have been answered, you could have the best person on liability from that legal team record a video and talk through the different options. So maybe in your form, you have 4 different options. You have super my employer friendly, super counterparty friendly option. And then maybe the team using all the data about what historically has been agreed, they've decided that, right, our default provision is this. And actually, if our person is, who is negotiating the contracts gets loads of those provisions unlocked within the agreements that they agree, maybe they get some kind of financial compensation. So we can later report on that and see, which of our negotiators are currently achieving the best commercial terms for the business from a risk perspective, as well as the overall volumes of deals that they're doing. So I think there's one point here in that those heroes who are actually negotiating really good terms for the business, they've got no way of actually saying, look, I'm getting green light, green light, green light, green light across the board because I'm so blinking persuasive. But at the moment, nobody's getting any credit for that. So there's one point there of people actually getting credit for negotiating those terms and that being, undeniable data. But actually, the quality of the advice that people have when from an educational perspective, when they're going in and trying to select the different options, whether that be my employer friendly or my employer unfriendly, can be that much better and it can be super interactive. And the other thing as well is you can integrate approval processes as well. So let's say the legal team, and I hear this a lot from legal teams, they're worried about someone selecting terrible provision for my employer when it comes to liability straight away. So obviously you can mitigate that with having guidance videos, but actually maybe we have a few, as you say, sort of middle options, and those middle options don't trigger an approval process necessarily. But if you select that terrible provision, then an approval process gets triggered, and you have to, explain why you're asking for a particular provision to be changed. So, I guess there's that middle ground between having to request that derogation, but then in that middle ground where something's okay, but you don't necessarily need to actually speak to someone legal. I'm using your word, James. You're actually empowered in the true sense, empowered and educated about it.
And in that sense, you're right, Giles, because if I am forced to accept a really bad term for my organization, but through that, with the supplier that I'm dealing with, I'm delivering, for example, $1 million worth of savings, then, procurement, and to a large extent sales as well, live in the real world in that sense and are willing to sort of cross trade that. Whereas, legal in a lot of cases are not maybe as commercially literate in that sense in terms of, what stakes are at play. And they understandably have a job to protect the business. Whereas a procurement professional or a sales professional is going to look at the bigger picture. And if that does trigger a need to review that with legal, then it's the small number of cases rather than a blanket policy, which I think in most cases, certainly speaking from personal experience, I would have been more than happy to do that, knowing what the commercial benefit would be to the business and versus the risk of accepting that watered down clause. So yeah, it is a two-way street. And I think bringing legal into the picture in terms of what is at stake or what are the commercial implications of dragging this out or insisting on a certain wording or clause can be hugely valuable. I love the idea of putting videos into the process or putting explainers in to enable the procurement professional or indeed the sales executive to be able to self-serve in that sense to reduce the amount of paperwork that goes to legal. Let's come on a little bit now in terms of the types of process automation that Avvoka can offer. But before I do that, can it also deal with third-party paper as well as native contracts? Is there a way that it can deal with non-standard contracts that are coming in where because of the power in the buyer-supplier relationship, your organization has no option but to accept the supplier's contract format? Yeah,
absolutely. So look, it works a lot better if you've got your own paper. And I think everybody understands that the whole process is better when you're using your own paper. Because even if you're not necessarily a contract expert, most procurement staff know their standard form contract inside and out. But yeah, you can absolutely upload that third party paper, and you can still use Avvoka for collaboration with your legal team, negotiation via the platform. And also for the analytics as well to a certain extent. But I think one of the things as well is sometimes that you do have to accept that you may have the leverage to you may not have the leverage to dictate whether they're your terms or not. But there's probably a pretty rare middle scenario where you're able to dictate not whose paper is used, but you're able to dictate the forum in which the negotiation happens. So I think there are scenarios where you're just going to have to continue to use the usual and the old way. But I think that we're seeing these types of technologies become so much more pervasive in the market, and I think people are slowly becoming to accept that actually negotiating via a more streamlined collaboration platform is the way to go. But yeah, I mean, we certainly had, even at BP International, we certainly had a double-digit percentage of people who just refused to use BP paper at all. I think the other thing as well is you don't necessarily have to use the collaboration and the negotiation functionality to benefit massively. Maybe the core benefit that you're after is actually just getting going and getting started. I think the other thing as well is ticketing. Where you're using a platform like Avvoka, one of the real benefits is actually sort of ticketing and getting assistance where you need it on that first draft, as opposed to all the way through the process necessarily. And actually, just to pick up on a point that you made a little bit earlier as well, James, you mentioned that the procurement and sales staff, they are really concerned with like those deal objectives. So making a saving, but also like getting the deal done. I think I do just want to make one point, which is that actually, where people are able, to use the platform like Avvoka for the course of the negotiation, whether that's their paper or somebody else's paper, it actually gives the legal team visibility as well of the deal velocity. And so, in black and white, it shows a couple of stats that are really important. How long they've sat on a particular draft. So it's sort of that concept of, customer service and ticketing that they're exposed to. But it also shows where their comments have actually held up a deal or have caused more turns of a document. So you can actually start to have, different ways of justifying, the work that lawyers are doing. So lawyers, instead of being rewarded on how many hours they've done, might be rewarded on, or the quality of advice they've given. It might be something that's a bit more quantifiable, like how quickly they turn those documents round, how few turns the documents that they've worked on have gone through. And so you can actually start to incentivize those lawyers in a slightly more commercial way as well. But I know that's slightly taking a gander in a different direction, James.
No, it's very, very relevant because, it's, law and I guess accountancy to some extent as well and consulting, these are the classic pay-per-hour professionals traditionally, aren't they? But if you're working with an in-house team rather than an external team, then the kind of KPIs that you can measure them on are infinite, really, aren't they? Because at the end of the day, they're an in-house service provider. They're an internal procurement and sales are internal customers of an in-house legal team, whereas a buyer-client relationship on the outside, if you're using an external counsel where it's typically paid by the hour, and that's the way it is, unless you can negotiate something different. So no, I think that's very, very relevant. Let's talk a little bit about automation. I wanted to use a couple of very extreme examples for you to hopefully sort of make it easy for the listener to understand to what extent Avvoka and its automation capabilities can assist. So let's look at, on the very simple side, a fairly standard non-disclosure agreement, NDA, that I think pretty much every procurement professional has sent out to a supplier in some shape or form over their careers, and pretty much every procurement professional would have to come into contact with in their role, whatever it is that they're buying. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, let's take a very, very complex IT or professional services contract that is, typically non-standard. You're not buying millions and millions of widgets that's very standardized. You're buying a very bespoke professional service, which necessitates quite a lot of bespoke contract terms, or certainly appendices to the contract. So can you maybe walk through those two different examples, whereas one, I guess, is going to be speed and efficiency, whereas the other one is, highlighting potential clauses that could be problematic or areas that may require some give and take?
The first thing to say, and not to be too contrarian about it, James, is that actually the process is actually probably one process in a lot of cases.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, to start off that process where you're doing that, let's say complicated master services agreement. The first stage of that process is actually probably signing the NDA before you even get talking about that other more complicated document. So absolutely, there is no sensible world in which someone should have to be submitting a request form or asking a lawyer to give them an NDA. Absolutely, the first thing that should happen is you get that email in the inbox saying, right, we're going to sell to you, or whatever it says, something a bit less wooden than that. You jump into your wiki or your internal portal. You in an ideal world, you've got something like Salesforce or some other, customer relationship management or vendor relationship management software. You go into the online portal, you type in the name of that vendor, and then all of the rest of the details about that vendor are pulled into your form, and then you press done. Either those are being pulled in from your, relationship management software, or that's being pulled in from a public, repository like Companies House, and then you press done. And then automatically that document has been sent to the email address associated with that potential, counterparty within your, relationship management system. So you're not even having to type in the email; it's already pulled through from your other source. And then, you don't even have to press send, and that automatically goes right into their inbox, fully drafted. And you've got an integration with DocuSign and Adobe Sign, which means that they just jump in, they click the link, and then they, encountered with, the DocuSign or Adobe Sign saying, please sign this NDA. That's and look, if they ever want to comment on that, then you can negotiate via the platform, etc. But that should be the scope of the process. It should be, one click onto the wiki, one type of, the client name, and then one click to press done. So it should be, one typing and 2 clicks overall, that whole process. Now,
interesting. So sorry, just to interrupt you just 1 second on that. So assuming then that the buyer knows what to send and that they have an internal repository of standardized unilateral and mutual NDA forms, then it should be an email-free process, is what you're saying. So it should be able to be managed through Avvoka and then through whatever your contract sign-off technology of choice is, be it Adobe Sign, DocuSign, or any other third-party provider of that.
Yeah, and absolutely. And look, I personally think it's bonkers that people even think about what type of NDA they're going to send through. It should just be, you click a button in your portal which says confidentiality agreement. Even better, it says, I've got a deal where I need to ensure confidentiality. I think it should always be phrased as problems. And then in the background, your legal team should have put together all different versions of the, disclosure agreement that you're ever going to possibly need. And then basically the relevant parts of that agreement just drop into whatever the agreement that's generated is based on the answers that you give. Now, I think questions like, should the obligations within this, NDA be mutual? I absolutely hate questions like that, because that is not a commercial question. You shouldn't be making legal decisions as a commercial person unless you absolutely have to. Maybe the job of the legal team should be, actually, look, if this is a potential purchase of over 50,000 British pounds, then what we need to do is we absolutely need to make this a mutual NDA. And then if it's less than that, then we're comfortable insisting that actually it's just them that owes us a duty of confidentiality. So, you come up with business rules like that. And then when you launch your questionnaire and you pull across all of the data from your customer relationship management, maybe we know the deal value from that customer relationship management software. So we know that it's 200,000. That drops straight into our form. We have the opportunity to change it and tweak it if we want, but we probably don't. And then we press done. And then we get a mutual NDA that sends off. We don't even care or know it's a mutual NDA, but it gets generated and then sent through to our counterparty, because the data that our legal team knows that we're already going to have, or we're going to be working with, that commercial information triggers the creation of a particular version of an NDA. But actually, it's just not necessary for that commercial person to have to think about that. So I hope that kind of process design, makes sense to you as well, James.
It makes a lot of sense, as long as the company is progressive enough to have all of that in place, which I guess is the stumbling block in most organizations, isn't it? I mean, what's your experience? Have you come across companies that do have that in place and can just slot Avvoka in, or do you normally find that you have to educate them around where they need to bring their other processes, into line to enable it to seamlessly function?
I'm selling you the dream here, James. So this is, when people first implement it, it's rarely that good. But, as with anything in life, don't try and get it perfect first time around, or you'll never actually get started with it. And I think the first thing to say is, a lot of people listening to this will be thinking, well, I'm not happy with any of my template contracts. They're all a bit defective, or I downloaded them, 4 years ago, or, copied them off of a counterparty ages ago, and we haven't really ever made them our own, or our product range has changed. So actually they're not quite right for what we need. Those people are all in the majority. But absolutely, I guess my kind of evangelizing, I suppose, is to legal people, as opposed to procurement people. These are the kinds of demands that absolutely should be placed on the legal team. And, I guess maybe you'll disagree with me, James, but I think personally, a lot of procurement people I speak to just don't want to think about this stuff. They just want to be able to click and get what they want and get on with their job. And actually, if you're sort of in charge of operations, feed that desire, really, and expect that from the legal team if we possibly can. But I guess be fair to them as well, in that they certainly need to be rewarded and given feedback as to, how much easier they are making life. And actually, with something like even a complex MSA, actually setting up one of those for automation and actually sort of deciding the at least a first template version of that contract it needn't take forever. I mean, we've seen these kinds of projects get up and running and completed within about sort of 3 weeks from not even having a template at the very beginning of the process.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you that I think most procurement people do just want to have the templates ready to go. I think the area where perhaps there is a little bit of misalignment is that legal will often think of all indirect spend as being able to follow the same contract template, whereas an IT contract and a transportation or a warehousing contract is going to be vastly different. Perhaps not in terms of red lines around limitation of liability and indemnity and that type of thing, but in terms of the service provision and things like intellectual property and those types of clauses are going to be very, very different. So I think that's the only area where I would push back and say I think legal and procurement probably need to talk to each other a little bit more in terms of understanding or helping legal to understand what are the different nuances between the different categories, so as that then enables them to go and do their job and provide templates that are relevant to, let's say, 80-90% of what's being bought.
I think that's bang on, James. And actually, I'm really glad that you've specifically called out both the example of IP clauses and also the example of different types of products that are being purchased. So one of my pet peeves when I was advising on this stuff was I'd always end up looking at contracts that had loads of provisions about developed IP in them. So effectively the ability for us as the company to own any stuff that was developed in the context of that particular transaction. So it's very relevant for software. If you're developing, you've hired someone to code something for you. Of course, you should own whatever they develop. But if if somebody is selling you potatoes for the cafeteria, they probably don't want to give you the rights to any amendments that they've made to their potato harvester and their boxing process. It's just entirely inappropriate, and that kind of stuff is what always holds up deals. But actually, I'm glad you've used the example of different product types, because I think that absolutely the information that the commercial person should be asked for is in that questionnaire. So let's say they've done the NDA, you've got that completed NDA. Then the next process is you jump into the Avvoka platform, you click that NDA that you have with that vendor, and then you click create related document. What it's going to do is it's going to fire up a questionnaire for your services agreement. But then the main question it's going to ask you is, what product types are you buying? And so then you click, I am buying a widget. I'm also buying a service to maintain that widget. And then the relevant schedules or parts of that document drop in. But that world or that vision can only be possible, James, where there is that, as you allude to, really good communication between legal and between procurement, because all they care about is the product that they're selling and that they have relevant provisions for it. But actually, it does take quite a bit of work in the background for that legal team to decide, hey, which of my provisions are required for this type of product, which are for this one, and which ones are mutually applicable, and so therefore need to be in every single draft, not just particular types of ones. So there's definitely a bit of sort of legwork to be done by the legal team, but it pays dividends in the long run.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Final thing that I wanted to ask you was around, especially in terms of automation, how do you deal with tracking changes in a document? Because that's one thing as a procurement pro, I just find Microsoft Word is really clunky for this, just in terms of how accepting and rejecting changes can affect the formatting of a contract that you've spent so long on, and also just keeping track of and ensuring that the integrity stays in the different changes that various counterparties have done to that contract. So how does Avvoka manage that?
So you negotiate on the platform. So if I'm sending, my catering supplier, my contract, they're getting a link and they're jumping into the Avvoka platform. And what they'll see on the first draft is a completely clean version of the contract, which they can go in and comment on if they have sufficient leverage. Maybe we block them from commenting on it at all, but that's a slightly different question. Let's say they mark up a couple of clauses. Then what they do is they send the document back to us. And what we will automatically see within the platform is the one source of truth. We will see a red line of what they've done to the contract since we sent it to them. And we will have our eyes drawn to that. And we know, because it's all via Avvoka, that they haven't messed around with those track changes. We don't need to run a manual comparison ourselves. We don't need to read it through line by line. We just know that that is exactly what has changed. We can accept and reject that and then mark it up ourselves and send it back. So you don't have this, idea of, oh my gosh, when did Steve last send the contract? Who was the last person to amend something? Because it's tracking who's doing what, whether that's different people on your side of the table who can all mark it up together in real time. And it's sort of logging those individuals and when they've done what they've done, or whether that is you seeing, okay, this contract has now been sat with the other side for however long. We can't see what they've done, but we know that they've been editing the document for 4 days. So the whole idea of kind of wrangling a version and knowing, what the new changes are versus the old changes is just a waste of time. So we've done away with that entirely. And hopefully we're able to provide a lot of reassurance around version control for clients.
What size of business would you typically need to be to see an ROI on this? I mean, I know it's a little bit subjective in terms of how many contracts do you have going through and the complexity, but just give me a rough idea.
Well, I'm going to sort of answer in a bit of an indirect way there, but I can come round to a slightly more direct answer. So our first package starts out at £300 per month. And so, effectively, you just have to be doing saving enough time to justify a £300 a month expenditure. And when we think about the hourly rates that lawyers charge, if you're saving sort of 1 hour of a decent associate, you've already made the saving there. But what I would also say is, a lot of what I've talked about is customer experience. I think you used that phrase as well, James, of the procurement teams, of the sales teams. So I think also finding qualitative measures as well, for the ROI, not necessarily just directly financial ones. So finding out, how people rate the legal team, how people rate the legal services that they've been provided, the velocity of the deals, and how quickly those are going through. So I think it will depend on business to business, but basically finding out what direct financial and indirect financial things you care about. And, things like happiness aren't to be kind of shirked at. I guess churn in any business, and particularly good procurement teams, is really, really costly. So I would say the return on investment doesn't have to be a huge amount if you make, a couple of your rock star procurement staff that much more happy. Because they're used to being unhappy with the legal service, probably, and they're much less likely to move if they feel like they're able to get their deals through that much cleaner with you and make their commission or whatever the case may be in terms of their incentives a bit quicker and in a higher volume. Yeah,
100%. And ease of use and making someone's job easier is absolutely a soft factor that's more difficult to measure, but is very, very, very relevant. I completely agree. I guess where I was kind of angling at with that is, and from your answer, I definitely get it, is that you're not solely an enterprise solution. And I guess any sort of mid-sized business that's big enough to have an established procurement team and a decent number of contracts going through it could quite easily see ROI on this, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and actually it's almost, some of the benefits are best for the smaller teams, because you may not have a legal team. You may have a consultant come in and refresh your templates for you. And then it might just be the best thing in the world to make sure that they're all automated. And then any procurement, stuff that you have, maybe you have 2 or 3, are just using that portal to access their contracts. And that they're using a version of the contracts that is exactly as that lawyer consultant that you got in, or those template documents that you bought at one stage, intended. So I think absolutely, the more, in some ways, the more resource constrained you are in that regard, the better. And of course, everybody also has insurance premiums. An insurance claim for one of these things going wrong, is likely to affect a smaller business more than it is a large one anyway. So, but I don't like to talk about the carrot or fear. I like to motivate from a place of positiveness and dreaming of it.
Yeah, but and rightly or wrongly, procurement are still broadly measured on savings as a primary objective of their reason to exist. And in a business where there is no in-house legal, then it's not just then an internal overhead or resource that you're saving through doing this. It's actually a real P&L visible cost if you're having to engage an external counsel or a team of consultants to come in and manage your contract. So in that case, I would almost argue that it's easier to show ROI than perhaps it is in a large enterprise, because it's a hard number rather than a soft saving of being able to deploy internal resources more strategically.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say as well is the lovely side effect of this is you're basically creating an out-of-the-box ability to generate a due diligence report about every single contract that your business has. There'll be people listening to this who have had to raise investment, or to frankly model the finances of their business. I'd be surprised if anyone running a business here hasn't had to do that. Actually being able to download the key information from every single one of your contracts at any one moment in time, whether they be customer contracts or costs, is hugely valuable and actually appreciably increases the value of your business, because the less skeletons that are, the less unknowns about a business, the more value there is to that business as a bottom line.
So final question, Giles, and this is going to be the easiest one to answer. If anybody would like to learn more about Avvoka or to connect with you, what's the best way that they can get in touch?
I mean, best way is to actually just email me or add me on LinkedIn. My name is Giles Thompson. That's Giles, and Thompson with an H and a P. My email address is giles@avvoka.com, and that's AVVOKA. Either that, or I'm sure there'll be lots of links in the podcast. Please get in touch. Would love to hear more from you and to show you what the platform can do with your specific contracts.
Yeah, and we will indeed link to your contact details in the show notes. Giles, it's been a pleasure. Great to talk to someone from the other side of the fence, so to speak. So really insightful for me as well. So good luck with your growth journey and keep in touch. Cheers.
Thanks very much, James. And thanks for keeping it good humoured and friendly, even though we're other sides of the fence.
So that was Giles giving us really a masterclass into the mind of how legal work and some of the frustrations from both sides of the fence, and how something like Avvoka can potentially bridge that gap and make everyone's lives a little bit easier. Just a couple of things before we sign off. Don't forget to check out our website, procurementsoftware.site, if you're looking for a short list of relevant procurement software according to your individual search criteria in less time than it takes to boil an egg. All of it completely free to anyone on the buy side. We do not operate a pay-to-play model. Also, we will be back with you next week with another episode. Until then, take care, look after yourselves, keep driving value, and bye for now.